This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What you are watching unfold is quieter than outrage and far more dangerous than a mistake. It's a system deciding in advance what reality is allowed to be. Evidence doesn't disappear here. It just stops mattering. Conclusions arrive first. Procedure follows later, rearranged to fit. You're told this is about a single moment, a single decision, a single outcome. But that framing is the trap. Because once a system learns it can declare an ending before the facts are gathered, it never has to listen again. It only has to repeat itself. Stay with me, because the most important part of this story isn't what happened in public, it's what quietly didn't happen afterward. And why that absence tells you more than any statement ever could. If this feels familiar, that's not an accident. And if you think the safeguards will correct it, watch what the safeguards are being trained to do next. This doesn't stop here. It moves forward. What actually controls this system now is not truth and it's not law. It's pre-commitment. Once the conclusion is spoken from the top, everything beneath it reorganizes. Agencies don't investigate forward, they investigate backward. Not to discover what happened, but to ensure nothing officially contradicts what has already been declared. That shift is subtle, and that's why it works. You're taught to believe power reacts to evidence. In this system, evidence reacts to power. Procedures are still performed, paper still moves, statements are still issued, but they're no longer load-bearing. They exist to give the appearance of motion while the destination stays fixed. This is how institutions stop asking questions without announcing that they've stopped. They narrow the frame. They reduce who's allowed inside the process. They decide quietly which steps are suddenly not necessary. And once that happens, accountability doesn't vanish. It's rerouted away from facts, away from witnesses, toward control. What matters next is not what this system says. It's what it strategically removes. Because the most revealing choices are the ones made in silence. That's where this starts to accelerate. There was a time when investigations moved outward. More eyes meant more friction. More agencies meant more resistance to error. That slowness was the point. Now watch the shift. The system learned that speed is not the advantage. Containment is. So instead of expanding the circle, it contracts it. Fewer participants, fewer voices, fewer variables that might introduce an inconvenient fact. This change didn't arrive with an announcement. It arrived disguised as efficiency, as streamlining, as professionalism. And because it happened gradually, it felt reasonable, almost invisible. Before, independence was a safeguard. Now, independence is treated as a risk. Once the circle is small enough, reality becomes manageable. Not because it's true, but because it's controllable. Evidence that fits is kept close. Evidence that doesn't fit is never formally invited in. And here's the dangerous part. This doesn't look like corruption from the inside. It looks like order. It looks like discipline. It looks like adults taking charge before things get messy. But that order has a cost. And the cost is that when something goes wrong, the system no longer asks how. It asks how quickly it can close. That's when the first visible shock arrives. And by then, the rules are already gone. The shock doesn't arrive as chaos. It arrives as a decision to do less than expected, to skip steps that used to be automatic, to quietly redefine what standard practice means without ever saying so out loud. This is where the system reveals itself not by what it announces, but by what it omits. An investigation begins, but key participants are never invited. The circle closes. Familiar safeguards are labeled unnecessary, not illegal, just optional. And because most people don't know what should happen next, the absence passes unnoticed. This is where the story turns technical, procedural, boring, if you're not paying attention. But this is the moment everything tilts. Because when you remove independent eyes early enough, you don't have to argue with them later. You're told the process is underway, you're told to be patient, you're told professionals are handling it, and technically, That's true. But professionalism can be repurposed. It can become a method of containment instead of discovery. If you're wondering why no competing account ever seems to solidify, this is why. The system has already decided which voices are allowed to exist. And once that choice is made, the next step isn't resolution, it's insulation. Here's what that insulation is really for. Not to hide evidence, to prevent it from ever becoming usable, because the most dangerous moment for this system is not public outrage. It's testimony. It's statements that can't be retracted, records that can't be softened later. So the mechanism activates early, before facts can harden. Key questions are delayed. Some are never formally asked. Not because the answers aren't important, but because answers create obligations. Once something is said on the record, it can be compared, cross-checked, challenged. Silence, by contrast, is flexible. This is how the system protects itself while appearing restrained. It avoids locking anyone into a version of events that might later collapse under scrutiny. No fixed timelines, no definitive sequences, no single moment that can be isolated and examined. What looks like caution is actually risk management for the institution, for the people inside it. The fewer facts produced, the fewer contradictions can exist. And the fewer contradictions, the easier it becomes to declare that nothing actionable happened. This is not incompetence, it's precision. Because the goal is no longer to reconstruct what occurred. The goal is to ensure there's never enough clarity to force accountability. But this approach has a flaw. One, it can't fully control. And it shows up when the story stops being administrative and becomes physical. That's next. Everything slows down on paper. But in reality, this is where speed returns. Because physical evidence doesn't negotiate. It doesn't reinterpret itself. It either exists or it doesn't. And the moment this story touches the physical world, control becomes uneven. One side of the system holds the instrument. The other holds the outcome. And that split matters. When a weapon is isolated inside a closed process, what it can reveal becomes optional. Sequences can be blurred, order can be softened, timing can be described instead of demonstrated, mechanics can be summarized instead of shown. But the body doesn't work that way. The body records angles, entry points, direction. The body doesn't care about statements or press lines or institutional comfort. It preserves the geometry of what happened, whether the system is ready or not. That's why this moment is dangerous for the structure you're watching. Because now there are two clocks running at once. One is administrative, slow, managed, adjustable. The other is forensic, silent, exact. And those clocks are rarely aligned. If they match, the system survives intact. If they don't, everything that's been avoided so far suddenly matters all at once. This is where certainty becomes fragile, because once sequence replaces narrative, explanations stop being flexible. And from here on, every delay has a cost. This is the point where the system stops being abstract, because this is where you enter the frame, not as a viewer, as a variable. If you think this only affects the people directly involved, that's the illusion doing its job. The real consequence isn't confined to one incident. It's embedded in what comes after, how thresholds quietly change. You start living under a rule you were never told existed, where outcomes are decided upstream, where explanations are retrofitted, where proximity to power determines whether facts are examined or managed away. And you feel it without being able to name it. In the hesitation to trust official timelines. In the instinct to record everything yourself. In the quiet calculation that says, if something happens, clarity may not be guaranteed. This is what institutional drift looks like at street level. It's not fear, it's uncertainty. The kind that makes ordinary moments feel conditional. And here's the emotional truth the system never addresses. When accountability becomes optional, vulnerability spreads outward. It doesn't stay contained. It radiates. You don't have to imagine yourself at the center of this to be affected by it. You only have to imagine being adjacent. And that's why this doesn't end here. because once this pattern holds, it doesn't stop at one jurisdiction. It starts to travel. Once it starts to travel, it doesn't move loudly. It moves structurally. Other systems notice. Other governments watch how this is handled, not in speeches, but in outcomes. They don't ask what was promised. They ask what was tolerated. And more importantly, what was normalized when a powerful state demonstrates that conclusions can precede evidence, that investigations can be sealed without consequence, that lethal decisions can be insulated indefinitely. It sends a signal, not just about force, but about permission. This is how practices migrate, not through policy memos, but through precedent, through the quiet understanding that accountability is negotiable if you control the process tightly enough. That transparency is optional if you frame delay as professionalism. What began as a contained domestic mechanism becomes a reference point, a template, something that can be cited, copied, adapted, because once the rule is bent successfully, it stops feeling exceptional. And here's the destabilizing part. This isn't about ideology. Systems with very different values can still learn the same lesson, that power is safest when it is procedurally protected, not publicly defended. That realization doesn't stay local. It moves through alliances, through agencies, through shared playbooks. And by the time anyone admits this is bigger than one case, the uncertainty has already crossed borders. What comes next isn't resolution, it's acceleration. From here, the future doesn't arrive as a single outcome. It fractures. There are three paths this system can take, and none of them are clean. The first is adjustment. The system absorbs the tension quietly. Procedures are rewritten just enough to survive scrutiny, new language appears, new safeguards are promised. Nothing fundamental changes, but the pressure dissipates. On the surface, stability returns. Underneath, the precedent remains intact. The second path is erosion. Each time this mechanism works, the threshold drops. Steps skipped once become optional forever. Oversight weakens through repetition, not because anyone declares it unnecessary, but because it no longer feels urgent. Accountability thins slowly until one day it's unclear where it was supposed to exist at all. And then there's rupture. That's when the administrative clock and the forensic clock collide. When something uncontrollable forces sequence into the open. When silence stops being protective and starts being incriminating. Rupture doesn't announce itself in advance. It arrives when the system least expects resistance from data, from timing, from an external authority it didn't anticipate. Which path prevails depends on forces you're not shown, decisions made off camera, delays that seem procedural, choices framed as caution. Nothing here is settled yet, but the direction is already being tested. And the final move hasn't been made. This is where the story is usually wrapped up, where you're offered reassurance, where someone tells you the system will correct itself. That's not what happens next. Because the most important power in this entire structure hasn't been procedural, it hasn't been investigative, it's been temporal. The ability to run out the clock, to decide not just what happens, but when it's allowed to matter. If time expires, evidence doesn't vanish, but its consequences do. Accountability becomes hypothetical, justice becomes conditional, and what was once unresolved quietly hardens into precedent. This is the danger you're being asked not to look at too closely. A system that doesn't need to win arguments. It only needs to last long enough, because once the window closes, even the clearest facts lose their force. Nothing here requires a cover story. Silence is sufficient. Delay is sufficient. Power used patiently is sufficient. So the question isn't whether this case will ever be revisited. The question is whether the system has already learned that it doesn't have to be. If you want to understand what comes next, if you want to see how this logic spreads, how it gets refined, how it becomes permanent, then you have to keep watching. Because this pattern doesn't end with one outcome. It ends with a rule being written. And once it is, it won't announce itself.